Hello again. This is the second video that I produced since I'm not going to be in class this week. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at the introduction yet, I would go stop this, go back and listen to that first because it's going to give you some of the basics of the course as a whole, which then leads into this video lesson. But okay, so today in this video clip we're going to be talking about visual design elements. And what these elements are essentially the pieces of the visual puzzle that we're going to be creating over the course of the semester, each of these individual elements. And they're going to be important because they're going to be what allows us to build the designs, to construct the designs in the way that we see fit. Now, they're not going to be helpful for telling us if it's a good design or not. We'll start to work in towards that once we start talking about visual design principles in the next video clip. But they will tell us, okay, what are the basic components? What's the basic elements that we're going to be putting into this design? It also will help us to break down other images and analyze them visually, with or without the design principle. Well, the design principles will help with that too. The last thing that I want to say is that when we're talking about visual design elements, we're going to be looking at them from the standpoint of how they affect meaning in an image. So not just, okay, here's size or here's color or something like that, but also how are they going to affect the meaning in a particular kind of a way in the image? How are they going to have the effect that we want them to have? Within visual design, there's a number of elements that we have control over that we can use to affect the meaning that we're trying to convey. These include form and shape, particularly from the standpoint of adjusting the size, adjusting the symbolism. We can also affect line, which we'll talk about, space, texture, and pattern, as well as perspective. We also have type, which we can focus on. We'll spend a class specifically on that, as well as color. Now with color, we also have this idea of value, which has to do with brightness of tone or lightness of tone. One thing that we're not going to be getting into is motion. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this class, but it does affect the way we interpret images visually very strongly. I want to give a couple definitions that we can work with. I'm not going to give these definitions later, but I do want to use them as starting points for what we're going to be talking about. The first has to do with the idea of composition. These are the placement and arrangement of visual elements on a given design. You can think of it as the overall structure or organization of the design. And with respect to composition, it's really how the individual elements work together. Now, from the standpoint of elements, which we've been talking about already, it's like these puzzle pieces. They're really one small part of the composition, such as a point or line, image, letter, word. It's really whatever it is that we use in order to convey a particular meaning. Okay, so let's take an example, and we'll start with our first real element that we're talking about. The first one has to deal with form or shape. Now, form is essentially what stands out from space. We're talking about space, particularly white space, in a little while. But really, the basis of any composition lays in its forms and its shapes beyond anything else. They're the basic thing that we might be talking about. So I want you to take a look at, first of all, the image in the top left corner. I want you to, again, write down anything that you think has to do with the different kinds of forms or shapes that you see in this image. So pause the video and we'll talk about this in a second. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what I think I see in this image in terms of the forms and the shapes. From the first of all, one form that I'm seeing is obviously the individual themselves. There's a clear person standing right there. Other forms that I see, first of all, are the very straight, angled lines. There's a number of those. I also see a number of overlaid circles that is affecting the meaning that's going on there. If you look behind the figure, there's some paint splatter, and then there's also some dots behind that. And from the standpoint of the dots, the circles, and the lines, I think that's really creating a sense of dynamism. It's really making the image very dynamic. We can also see that the person form itself has been cut and is sort of displaced a little bit, particularly from the standpoint of if you look at between those two lines. We can kind of take that to be the meaning that the identity be shattered or fractured or something along those lines, or that we're looking through a mirror. And then lastly, I think the paint splatter comes across as being very edgy and interesting. So now take a second and let's think about the sweet image in the bottom right corner. So pause this video and write down some ideas about what you think the sweet image is all about. Okay, what I think seeing the sweet image is, it's a little less complex than the other image, but it still has a very powerful meaning. First of all, one aspect of form that's standing out to me is the typeface. It's not a very stodgy, it's not a very rigid typeface, it's a very flowy and playful typeface. I think that's a big part of this, particularly what we're going to talk about in a second. Then we've got the dark brown liquids, essentially puddling underneath the text, and then also coming off in drips. And what this really has to deal with the meaning is this idea of melting chocolate or melting chocolate ice cream or something along those lines. So we can see here how form, in both cases, is really tied to the way, the kind of meaning that the designer is trying to put across here. Okay, let's also talk about form and shape, not just from the standpoint of, there's forms in this aspect, but of symbols, of things that we can pull out and recognize individually. On this one, this is a pretty clear one. The symbol here is Nike. We recognize the top left corner. But we can also use different design elements to change the meaning of it. So in the middle top image, what we have is essentially what looks somewhat like a baseball diamond. So that's what that's trying to do, is associate Nike with baseball, to tell us Nike baseball. In the next image, what we see is a broken Nike arrow, swoosh. And essentially, this could have a lot of different meanings, but it could mean that something's broken about Nike, or that it's intense. I've heard people talk about it in lines of hockey, or those of you who remember way back when Nike had some issues with sweatshop labor, and it could be somebody's trying to make a commentary on that. But we recognize it, even though it's broken apart, as a coherent symbol. In the bottom left corner, we have a Nike symbol. It essentially looks like it's got sparks coming out of fire. This gives us the idea of intensity. There's a little bit of smoke coming out of it as well. But, it's hot. It's electrified. And I think this particular symbol has been associated with Nike sprinting. So again, it gives you that idea of speed and quickness and sort of electricity. And then the last one, we got two symbols here, but we should recognize both of them. We've got Nike and we've got Apple. And what putting them together does is it talks about an association, a partnership between the two. Also, we've got this circle around it, and this has to do with the Nike Plus system. But the circle around it, I've heard people talk about it, kind of looks like a track. So we've got that as well. So let's dive deeper into form a little bit. And another aspect that we can talk about is size. I'm not going to give a definition of size, it should be pretty straightforward. But what we should know is that size can be used to help determine the relative importance of something. So I want you to take a look at the image on the left. It's a poster, and I want you to think about what elements are big and what elements are small, and why are they important in that way. Pause the video when you get a chance to do that. Okay, so what we have here, there's a number of different elements. And the first is that the numbers are very big. We've also got the faces being very big, and the text in the center that's very big. So let's talk about first of all, the numbers. This gives the idea of a very quantitative approach. So the way they're trying to prove their point is very quantitative as opposed to more rich text description. We've got the face in there, which really helps to personalize this, whereas if it was just data, it kind of feels a little overpowering, but the face helps to personalize it and give it a little bit more personality. And then the text in the center, if you haven't been able to figure out yet, is really the title of this poster. We assume that we have to put the title at the top left corner or in the top center, but that's not the case. We can put the title wherever we want. We just need to visually represent it in such a way that it gets that point across, that it is the title, it is the most important. And then the small text is really the detail text. Take a look at the other image now. And take a second and see if we can look at, again, what's the importance of the big elements versus the small elements. Okay, what we have here, and if you've been able to figure it out, it has to deal with Obama. But we've got really the biggest elements at the top and bottom of the text. And we've got smaller elements that are more of the sort of the detail of what this text is. The large text elements at the top and bottom are representing really the main argument, the main history that this poster is trying to put across. The smaller detail really, it almost forces you in to get closer, look at it, to read it, to understand what it's saying. Now, I do want to say, without the color here, this would be impossible to pull off because there's so much small text, it just wouldn't work. But the color helps to segment different areas. So let's talk about a couple more terms here. The first one that we brought up was symbol. So what a symbol means is it's representing an idea, concept, or object through an image or another word. The key thing here is that symbols are meaningful independent of the context. We saw how we can use them in different contexts and it changes the meaning, but it still has the same idea. We still pull on that same meaning. Symbols refer not just to an entity, but also other emotions and values. The other thing that we've talked about is form. Form is the shape or visible structure of a thing or person, as we've talked about already. Let's introduce a couple more design elements. Now, we mentioned line already, and particularly from the standpoint of form, it's essentially what's going to define the form for us. But in addition to creating the edges of forms, lines help to create really intense aspects of the image. It can help draw attention, it can create dynamism, it helps to create closure within an image, which otherwise we might not have, and it also helps provide contrast. Now in this image we have three different images, one of which we talked about already. Let's talk about that first image that we've seen already, the woman. And in that image, essentially what we're looking at is a very dynamic image due to the lines that we're creating. The lines aren't just the straight lines themselves, but the lines also created by the circles, by the paint splatters, and all that as well. Now, if we look at the image of the man in the soccer uniform, it would be one thing to just see that man by himself. It clearly look like he's excited, but it doesn't bring the audience member into that excitement. The extra lines that we see there really creates that excitement, that movement, that we don't, the emotional aspect that we don't, that we can infer, but we don't see. Those lines help to create that seeing of that emotion. And lastly, up at the top in the left corner, what we'll see here is really a traditional looking Japanese image, but the content here is vastly different. And the images here are very turbulent, and it goes with that whole sort of wavy theme. It's almost violent image. In this case, I already talked about how line helps to define form. This is a different case where form is actually helping to define line. And essentially what we have is sort of these meta images that emerge because we've got many different little individual forms creating a greater composition. And this is very complicated, but it's a very engaging type of visual design.